December 3rd, 1964, a bitter, below-zero morning in the Midwest. A group of engineers stood gathered around a Chevrolet C60 dump truck that hadn't so much as coughed to life in nearly 6 weeks. The oil inside its crankcase had thickened like syrup, the air so cold it stung their lungs. But when they jumped the battery and turned the key, the old 292 Inline-Six came alive instantly. No choke, no throttle feathering, just the pure mechanical heartbeat of Detroit steel, defying nature itself. This wasn't luck, this was legacy. Engines like this weren't just built, they were forged to outlast time itself. Two mechanical titans, born from rival factories in Detroit, would go on to dominate America's farms, factories, and freight yards for decades. The Ford 300 and the Chevy 292 weren't flashy, and they never needed chrome to prove their worth. These engines were Detroit's dirtiest secret, machines so overbuilt they could outlive the very trucks they powered. But their strength came at a cost, because as history would later reveal, both Ford and Chevrolet quietly worked to hold them back. The reason? These inline-sixes were so good, so indestructible, they could have made the V8 obsolete and cost their makers billions. What followed was one of the most fascinating engineering rivalries in American history, the 30-year war between Ford and Chevrolet. While the public swooned over roaring muscle cars and flashy V8s, out in the fields and on the highways, two humble inline-sixes were quietly earning a reputation that would last generations. Chevy struck the first blow with its 292, a brainchild of Ed Cole's engineering team. They built it like a tank, 7 massive main bearings, a forged crankshaft, and a stroke of 4.125 inches that gave it unstoppable low-end torque. When Cole's team presented the dyno sheets to GM executives showing the engine's true potential, over 400 horsepower, management panicked. A leaked internal memo from 1963 later exposed the truth. GM deliberately limited the engine's output to 165 horsepower so it wouldn't outperform their beloved V8 lineup. Must not exceed base 283 V8 output, the memo warned. And just like that, the 292's true power was locked away. Still, even restricted, the Chevy 292 was a legend in the real world. It didn't live in garages or racetracks, it lived in tow trucks, delivery vans, and farm rigs that saw more work in one day than most muscle cars did in a lifetime. Ranchers and truckers across America swapped stories of these engines surviving without coolant, running for miles after losing oil pressure, or towing loads twice their rated weight. One old rancher named Donnie Miller once said, "My 1969 C10 with a 292 went through fires, floods, hell, and divorce court. I wrecked that truck, but that engine still started on the first crank." Ford wasn't about to be outdone. In response, they unleashed their own masterpiece, the 300 cubic inch Inline-Six. It was developed by Del Harter's engineering team, the same minds behind Ford's legendary overhead valve sixes. The 300 was based on the 240, but stroked and strengthened with a larger 4-inch bore that allowed for bigger valves and superior breathing at low RPMs. Mechanics nicknamed it the Brick, partly for its 485-pound weight, but mostly for its indestructible build. One Ford engineer wrote in his journal, "We ran the 300 at full load for 300 hours straight. It didn't flinch once." The report concluded bluntly, "Performance applications not recommended. Engine exceeds projected service life models." Unlike car engines dressed up for truck duty, Ford's 300 was purpose-built from the crankshaft up to do the hard labor, hauling, towing, idling for days, and starting cold morning after morning without complaint. Its design philosophy was simple but brilliant, durability and versatility above all else. While muscle car engines were chasing horsepower numbers, the Ford 300 and Chevy 292 were quietly rewriting what reliability meant in the working world. Beneath their grime and rust lay some of the most over-engineered mechanical hearts ever built. Engines that were, in truth, ticking performance time bombs, capable of far more than their makers ever allowed. In raw numbers, the Ford 300's later fuel-injected versions cranked out 265 pound-feet of torque at a lazy 2,000 RPMs, with only about 150 horsepower, but torque that could twist axles. The Chevy 292, slightly smaller at 4.8 liters, managed 165 horsepower at 3,800 RPMs and 280 pound-feet of torque at that same low end. These weren't engines for racing, they were built to move mountains and live forever doing it. Each had thick cast iron blocks, forged cranks, and enough internal strength to survive abuse that would kill lesser motors. Ford's massive 7-main bearing crank gave it near unbreakable stability, while Chevy's lighter 4-main design made it quicker to rev, especially when tuned by gearheads who knew what they were doing. Ford's larger bore, 3.98 inches, to Chevy's 3.76, gave the 300 a breathing edge, especially with its bigger valves that improved efficiency at low speeds. Meanwhile, Chevy's engineers perfected their intake manifold design to ensure even fuel distribution to all 6 cylinders, solving a common inline-six flaw. Both companies played a chess game of design trade-offs. Ford went for longevity and smoothness, Chevy for torque and balance. Their compression ratios told the same story. Chevy's 7.8 to 8.1 range kept things conservative, while Ford's steady 8.8 to 1 pushed efficiency without sacrificing toughness. Chevy's 292 stayed proudly mechanical from birth to death, carbureted, simple, and brutally honest. Early models ran Rochester single and 2-barrel carbs, and later ones, though burdened with emission systems, kept that raw character. Ford, on the other hand, evolved. By 1987, the 300 introduced throttle body fuel injection, TBI, and computer-controlled ignition, giving it a new lease on life. Suddenly, the old workhorse was starting smoother, running cleaner, and sipping fuel more efficiently than ever. The 292 remained a loyal analog warrior, but Ford's 300 quietly stepped into the modern age without losing its soul. Both engines were nearly impossible to kill. The Chevy 292's 7 massive main bearings held the crank like a vault, spreading stress across its block and allowing it to handle brutal loads for decades. Its long stroke design delivered endless low-end grunt, while the forged crankshaft laughed at fatigue. Even the longer connecting rods were a stroke of genius, reducing wear and extending life under heavy use. Ford's matched that toughness pound for pound. With its thick cast iron block, reinforced main webbing, and oversized coolant passages, it was built to endure heat, cold, and years of non-stop abuse. These weren't just engines. They were symbols of a time when American engineering meant something, when parts were overbuilt, not under-budgeted. The Chevy 292 and Ford 300 weren't born in boardrooms. They were built in machine shops by people who understood what work really meant. They became legends not because of marketing or magazine covers, but because they earned it. One load, 1 mile, and one cold start after another.
You can still find old Chevy 292s thundering away inside dusty Gleaner and John Deere harvesters, refusing to die even after decades of hard labor under brutal heat. These engines earned their reputation for one reason. They were brutally simple and built like iron tanks. With 7 thick main bearings distributing the load evenly, a forged steel crankshaft that could handle endless torque, and long connecting rods that minimized piston wear, the 292 was practically indestructible. Its carbureted system was so basic that any farmhand with a screwdriver and determination could rebuild it under a shade tree. These machines didn't need premium fuel or perfect oil. They thrived on neglect, cheap gas, and grit, and still ran like champions. Many irrigation pumps across America ran on these engines non-stop for decades, maintained only with an oil can and a wrench. Meanwhile, Ford's legendary 300 inline-six carved its own legacy under the harshest conditions imaginable. Nicknamed the Million-Mile Motor, it powered UPS vans, F-150s, Econolines, and countless industrial machines. Owners and enthusiasts on classic Ford forums often brag about hitting 500,000 to 1 million miles with nothing more than regular oil changes and spark plug swaps. Like the 292, It relied on 7 main bearings for crankshaft stability and a massive 450-pound cast iron block that could handle punishing workloads day after day. When Ford upgraded the engine with throttle body injection in 1987, it became nearly unstoppable. No more carburetor headaches, smoother starts in all weather, and self-adjusting fuel delivery that could adapt to altitude, temperature, and load. Its 12-port head design improved airflow, keeping everything cool under pressure, while still producing 265 pound-feet of torque at just 2,000 RPM. These engines didn't just last, they endured. In the real world, both the Ford 300 and Chevy 292 proved nearly indestructible. Their cooling systems were cleverly engineered. Ford's massive water jackets kept the cylinders cool, while Chevy's oiling system ensured smooth lubrication even under extreme heat. Fleet records from the 1970s and 80s showed the Ford averaging over 215,000 miles before needing major repairs, with the Chevy close behind at around 198,000. Both outlasted many V8s of the era, despite being worked harder and maintained less. Sure, each had its quirks. Timing gears could wear on high-mileage 292s, and the Ford sometimes leaked oil around its front seal, but these were minor flaws for engines that simply refused to quit. The Chevy 292 belonged to the analog age, built for mechanics who tuned by ear and learned through experience, not diagnostic screens. Maintenance was refreshingly straightforward. Oil changes every few thousand miles, valve adjustments now and then, and an occasional carb tune-up with nothing more than a screwdriver. The separate intake and exhaust manifolds made upgrades easy, and GM's massive parts network meant components were always within reach. Even decades later, stores still stock gaskets and rebuild kits for these engines. Early 292s are loved for this simplicity. Any backyard mechanic could get one running again. The later smog-era versions added emissions gear and integrated manifolds that complicated repairs, but even those could be revived by dedicated enthusiasts. The 300 shared that same repairable spirit, accessible, forgiving, and tough as nails. Whether used in a work truck or generator, these engines earned the trust of people who relied on them daily. Their biggest strength was reliability, but their biggest weakness was corporate politics. Both Ford and Chevy deliberately held these engines back. Behind closed doors, internal memos and test reports from the 1960s and 70s revealed what the public never knew. These inline-sixes were capable of much more. Engineers built experimental versions of the 300 that made over 230 horsepower with minor upgrades, a better camshaft, improved compression, and cleaner heads. Chevy's 292 prototypes reached 210 horsepower with nothing more than tuning tweaks and improved breathing. These were real, tested numbers, not rumors. But both projects were quietly buried. Why? Because a 6-cylinder engine performing as well as a V8 would have upended the marketing hierarchy. The Big Three sold cars through status, and the V8 badge meant premium. The 6s had to remain humble to protect the brand's profits. Former GM engineers later admitted frustration. One recalled designing a high-flow 292 head that boosted airflow by over 20%. Cheap to make, easy to install, but it was shelved immediately with no explanation. He quit the next week. Another leaked memo from 1966 confirmed the existence of a Hyperpack 292, a high-compression prototype that produced 210 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque before being scrapped because it outperformed the 283 V8. Ford's 300 was also throttled by management. Engineers in 1972 developed an experimental variable valve timing setup that increased efficiency by 15% and expanded the power band by 1,500 RPM, years before Honda made such tech famous. It was canceled just before production. When the 1973 oil crisis hit, logic said Ford and Chevy should have leaned into their durable and efficient 6-cylinders. Instead, they doubled down on their thirsty V8s, because those engines brought higher margins. The 292 and 300 were detuned, fitted with restrictive intakes and emission systems that choked their true potential. The truth was simple. These engines were never underpowered by nature. They were held back by design. Even so, not everyone followed the rules. While the corporations tried to bury the 6s, racers and mechanics across the country quietly proved their power. In Ohio, drag racer Dave Stoll dropped a modified 292 into a 1955 Chevy Gasser. Twin carbs, ported head, no mercy. He clocked a 12.8-second quarter mile at 107 miles per hour, shocking spectators who thought inline-sixes were slow. In 1978, Baja racing legend Walker Evans entered a Ford F100 with a mostly stock 300. With minimal mods, just headers, a cam, and a better radiator, he finished ahead of dozens of V8 trucks. Ford wasn't happy and reportedly told him to stop embarrassing their flagship engines. The 6-cylinder rebellion grew.
From SCCA track cars to dirt oval racers, people began discovering that these engines could hang with or beat their 8-cylinder rivals. A 292-powered Chevy Love pickup won 3 consecutive races in the early 70s. In 1980, a Ford 300 truck claimed class victory at the grueling Mexican 1000 off-road race, beating larger V8s simply by surviving to the finish line. Today, both engines have achieved cult status. Modern builders are resurrecting them with new technology: fuel injection kits, performance heads, roller rockers, and turbochargers. With a few bolt-on mods, a 292 can easily reach over 400 horsepower, while a tuned Ford 300 can push similar numbers with unmatched torque and reliability. Their forged cranks and heavy-duty blocks make them ideal foundations for modern performance builds. In the 2020s, restored and upgraded versions of these engines are commanding premium prices. Pristine Ford 300s go for up to $9,000, and early 292s are closing in on $5,000 or more. The aftermarket scene is booming again, driven by nostalgia and respect for real engineering. Modern kits now let these engines breathe like they were always meant to. Turbo setups running 10 to 15 psi safely, EFI systems that deliver modern reliability, and cam upgrades that unlock buried power. What was once Detroit's buried secret has become a badge of honor. The Ford 300 and Chevy 292, two humble workhorse engines that refuse to die, are now celebrated as symbols of a lost era of overbuilt, underappreciated engineering. They were meant to serve quietly, but instead, they became legends. The truth isn't just about what they were, it's about what they could have been if Detroit hadn't silenced them.